The Phantom Express. It was a cold, foggy night when Daniel boarded the midnight train bound for Black Hollow, a small town on the outskirts of the countryside. He was the only passenger in his compartment, which was dimly lit by the flickering yellow glow of overhead lights. The train whistled ominously as it departed the station, cutting through the thick mist that shrouded the tracks. Daniel leaned against the window, watching the dark landscape rush by. He had heard strange stories about this train before, rumors whispered by old conductors and seasoned travelers. They called it the Phantom Express, a train that carried more than just the living. The journey was uneventful at first. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the rails and the occasional whistle of the engine lulled him into a state of drowsiness. But as the train sped further into the night, an eerie sensation crept over him. The air inside the compartment grew cold, and a strange hush settled over the train, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. A sudden thud echoed from the corridor, jarring Daniel awake. He turned toward the sound, his heartbeat quickening. Through the dim light, he saw a shadow moving past the frosted glass of his compartment door. It was tall and gaunt, its shape unnatural, almost floating. Curious but hesitant, Daniel slid the door open and peered into the corridor. It was empty. The train swayed gently as it glided through the darkness, but there was no sign of anyone. He shivered, telling himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Settling back into his seat, he tried to dismiss the unease gnawing at him. But then, the compartment light flickered wildly before plunging into total darkness. The train's rhythmic sounds became muffled, as if the entire world had been submerged underwater. And then, he heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, almost lost in the hum of the train, but it grew steadily louder. It was a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, calling his name. Daniel, Daniel, help me. His blood ran cold. He turned his head sharply, his breath catching in his throat. Across from him sat a figure he hadn't noticed before. It was a woman, draped in a tattered, old-fashioned dress, her long dark hair cascading over her pale, ghostly face. Her eyes were hollow, black as the night outside. Daniel scrambled backward, his mind racing. Who are you?" he stammered. The woman tilted her head, an eerie sadness in her expression. "I never made it home," she whispered. "They left me here, alone, in the dark." Suddenly, a violent jolt shook the train. Daniel gripped the edge of his seat as the entire carriage seemed to shudder under an unseen force. The woman's form flickered, like an image on an old television screen. Then, with a soft sigh, she began to fade. Before she disappeared completely, she raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the end of the corridor. "Find me," she murmured before vanishing into thin air. The lights flickered back on. The train was once again moving steadily, the previous disturbances erased as if they had never happened. Daniel's breath came in short gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. Determined to make sense of what he had just seen, he staggered out of his compartment and hurried down the corridor. The train felt eerily deserted. Carriage after carriage, he found empty seats, abandoned belongings, but no passengers. It was as if the train itself had been frozen in time. Then he reached the last carriage. The door creaked open, revealing an old, unused compartment covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with decay, and the scent of rusted metal filled his nostrils. In the dim light, he saw a row of wooden benches, their surfaces scratched and worn. And then, at the far end of the compartment, he saw it. A lone suitcase, faded and covered in grime. He hesitated, then stepped closer, his fingers trembling as he reached out. The moment he touched it, a vision flashed before his eyes. A young woman, dressed in the same tattered gown, stepping onto the train decades ago. She was excited, clutching a small ticket, her smile full of hope. But something went wrong. The train derailed in a storm, plunging into a river below. The wreckage was salvaged, the survivors rescued, but her body was never found. Daniel gasped, yanked back to the present. He looked around the carriage, realizing the truth. This was the last ride of those who never left the train. The whispers, the cold, the flickering lights. This train carried the spirits of the forgotten. With shaking hands, he picked up the suitcase and whispered, "I found you." A gust of wind swept through the compartment, and for a brief moment, he felt warmth. The air lightened, and the train groaned as if releasing a long-held breath. The woman's voice, soft and relieved, whispered one last time, "Thank you." Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the train jolted to life. A station loomed ahead, and with a final shudder, the Phantom Express came to a halt. The doors opened, revealing the dawn breaking over Black Hollow. Daniel stepped off the train, his hands still gripping the suitcase. Behind him, the train let out a long, mournful whistle before vanishing into the mist, leaving nothing but silence and the ghost of a memory.